Hey, good morning everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on Facebook and YouTube this morning. Today we're continuing our class, I Object, Why Some People Disbelieve. And last week we raised the question, doesn't religion hinder morality? Now if you were able to watch that video, first let me say thank you. Last time we discussed how some people argue that religion makes people less moral, or at the very least, some people believe religious belief, like humanity created in God's image, is necessary to ground universal morals. Now the problem with that kind of thinking is the irreconcilable tension that arises when you try to argue, on the one hand, that humans are just collections of atoms that got here by random chance or dumb luck, and they can't even really make moral choices because there is no such thing as morality. But on the other hand, you try to argue that humans are also inherently worthy of dignity and have certain inalienable rights. It's virtually impossible to justify holding both of these ideas simultaneously. So if we take a lesson from American history, for example, many of our country's founding fathers were Christians, but some weren't. Some were deists. They believed in a higher transcendental power, but had views about Jesus that we would find strange or even unbiblical. But either way, Christian or deist, they all held these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. They realized that our rights and the inherent equality of humanity is granted by God, not by governments or the natural world. And so this week, we're going to look at a similar objection that many people raise about Christianity and other religions as well. Doesn't religion cause violence? Now, the idea that religion causes violence has been pretty popular for close to 100 years now. In 1930, British philosopher Bertrand Russell remarked, "Religion prevents us from removing the fundamental causes of war. Religion prevents us from teaching the ethic of scientific cooperation in place of the old fierce doctrines of sin and punishment. It is possible that mankind is on the threshold of a golden age, but if so, it will first be necessary to slay the dragon that guards the door, and this dragon is religion." Now, and I find it ironic that he said this in 1930, right before the outbreak of World War II, and the 20th century is arguably the bloodiest century in human history. But more on that later. Anyway, a lot of people are convinced by this kind of thinking espoused here by Bertrand Russell. And if we're being honest with ourselves, a lot of people who hold religious beliefs have done some pretty horrific things to other people. Sometimes they believe that what they're doing is God's will or that they are fulfilling some divine mandate. Now remember last week I told you about Nadia Murad's story of captivity within ISIS, how she was treated because she was considered an infidel. The judge who bought her and several other girls believed he was fulfilling a religious duty by forcing them to become Muslim. And like I said last week, anti-religious people look to these kinds of examples and will say that religious belief therefore leads people to violence. Islam, especially as it is practiced by ISIS or Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, is not the only religion with a violent past. It's easy for us to find examples of violence done in the name of Islam because many of us remember September 11th and how Islamic terrorists flew airplanes into the Twin Towers and also the Pentagon. But last week I mentioned that it is ignorant to denounce religion as the cause of this or that or whatever type of evil because religion is such a huge term. I referred last week specifically to Buddhist nonviolence because that is a popular image when someone thinks of Buddhism. At least the sort of watered down Western conceptions of Buddhism as a religion consisting of vegetarianism, yoga, and meditation. At least, like I said, that's how a lot of Westerners think of Buddhism when they think of Buddhism. But Buddhism is the world's fourth largest religion and has several different branches and interpretations of the Buddha's teaching. Now, Buddha just means awakened or enlightened one. Basically, the idea behind Buddhism, and I'm summarizing just for the sake of give us some quick context. Basically, the idea is that if you can fully incorporate the Buddha's teachings, then you can escape or liberate yourself from the cycle of reincarnation. Buddhist meditation and detachment from worldly possessions and suffering are some of the best ways to achieve this kind of enlightenment, again, according to Buddhist teachings. Now, most people think of peaceful meditation, like I said, when they think of Buddhism, but this is actually a fairly incomplete picture. In the country of Myanmar in Southeast Asia, almost 90% of the population identifies as Buddhist. Myanmar soldiers have committed unspeakable atrocities against the people of the Rohingya village, a village composed predominantly of Muslims. According to this 2017 opinion piece from the New York Times, the violence against the Rohingya Muslims amounts to genocide, but there's been little response from other Eastern or Western powers. Buddhism also had a dark 20th century as well, and this op-ed from the New York Times in 2018 looks at the compliance of Buddhist institutions in World War II era Japan. Also mentions Sri Lanka's civil war from 1983 to 2009, a Buddhist majority country as well. The point of all this isn't to show that Buddhists are any better or worse than anybody else, but I do think it's important for us to keep in mind that perception is not always equal to reality. Some people will point the finger at Christianity and say that they want nothing to do with the church because of Christianity's violent past. The Crusades almost always get brought up in these kinds of arguments. Now, I'm not going to spend much time going into detail about what happened during the Crusades, but it will be helpful to look at them just briefly to give us some idea of what happened and why some people might point to Christianity and say, I don't want anything to do with that because of the Crusades. Christianity had been comfortably rooted in Jerusalem for centuries when Muslim armies gradually swept westward from Arabia. Now, originally, Christian religious travelers, also known as pilgrims, not to be confused with the types of pilgrims that came across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. But originally, Christian travelers, in the early medieval era, so 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, they were granted access to holy sites in and around Jerusalem if they paid a fee, but eventually they became a targeted and persecuted religious minority. Now, European Christians at the time were urged to protect their fellow Christians in Jerusalem, and in 1096, the First Crusade to Jerusalem officially began. Jerusalem was eventually captured and returned to Christian control, but the cost and loss of life was devastating. As many crusaders marched through Europe on their way to Jerusalem, they harassed and attacked Jewish communities. Once Jerusalem was finally taken, the fighting spread to neighboring regions, and terrible things were committed by crusaders who believed it was God's will for them to do these things. There's some very legitimate criticisms that can be made about the Crusades. Now, protecting religious minorities from persecution as they travel to holy places is one thing, and that's a good thing. But making war upon women and children is something completely different. And that's exactly what happened to Muslim women and children at the hands of European crusaders who marched into town with flags bearing the cross. Now, throughout this study, I've referred to several different religions: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and even paganism, which is another large umbrella term that covers a variety of things. But what you might not know is that the term religion is also used to describe secular worldviews. Here's a good definition of secular religion. A secular religion is a communal belief system that often rejects or neglects the metaphysical aspects of the supernatural, commonly associated with traditional religion, instead placing typical religious qualities in earthly entities. The idea is that the kind of devotion Christians have to God, for example, is mirrored by secular religion, but directed toward a certain politician or political party or country or some other worldly institution. Some of the clearest examples of secular religion can be found in 20th century history: communist Russia and China, as well as Nazi Germany. Karl Marx believed that religion was simply a tool used to drug the masses of the people to keep them from rising up against the wealthy. And so it was Marx's plan to eradicate religious belief. But instead of creating a utopian society for workers, what actually happened in Soviet Russia was that figures like Lenin and Stalin rose to prominence and power, and despite being officially atheistic, devotion to the Soviet state began to mirror religious devotion, began to look like religious devotion. 61 million people were killed in the former Soviet Union, and another 35 million people were killed in the People's Republic of China. Smaller atheistic communist states like North Korea, Cambodia and Vietnam have experienced horrific human rights abuses as well. But if we're going to talk about secular religion in the 20th century, then we have to discuss Nazi Germany. Like it or not, Germany's religious past is our religious past. And Germany's religious past is directly related to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Now, we've all heard the name Martin Luther. In 1517, Martin Luther was just a young monk who disputed only a few particular teachings of the Catholic Church, and he raised these issues hoping to engage in an academic debate. He did not originally set out to break away from the Catholic Church, but as church officials continued to pressure Luther to recant his views, he held firm. The Catholic Church's base of power is in Vatican City in Rome, and Martin Luther was based in one of the German-speaking territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, in Luther's day, there was no one single country known as Germany. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't actually based in Rome either. It was based in it was a collection of a number of German-speaking territories, but also covered portions of modern-day Germany, France, Austria, Switzerland, Poland, and other countries as well. Now, the Italian-based Catholic Church took money from these provinces, and so while Luther was initially interested in an academic debate about the biblical basis of certain Catholic teachings, his rejection of the Roman Catholic Church's spiritual power encouraged others to begin rejecting the Catholic Church's political and earthly power. Fast forward in history a couple of hundred years, and most Germans were either Lutheran or Catholic. Now, as we go through history, we can see how the Protestant Reformation, begun by Luther, spread to places like England. Religious pilgrims, I mentioned pilgrims just a few minutes ago, religious pilgrims left England for the New World and eventually settled in the English colonies here in North America. Now, eventually, the Second Great Awakening began in the early 1800s here in the U.S., and many American Christians sought to return to Scripture for the basis of doctrine and practice in much the same way that Martin Luther did when he protested certain Catholic teachings. You can see this idea of returning to Scripture. It started with Luther and the other reformers, and it continues, especially in churches of Christ today. Now, in many ways, Christianity in the U.S. is what it is because of what Martin Luther did 500 years ago. And so, like I said, Germany's religious past is our religious past, at least in part. Now, what happened in Germany in the 20th century should be a warning to Christians everywhere. Anyone who claims to speak for God must be measured against the example of Jesus himself. Hitler was very aware of the power of religion, and in his book Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle, he claimed that he wanted to protect Germans from godless communism. In 1933, not long after Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, or abbreviated Nazi Party, after they assumed power, he signed an agreement with the Vatican pledging to protect church freedoms and interests. Hitler used the German national religion, which was Christianity, only as much as he needed to in order to gain power. But what swept through Germany in the 1930s looked nothing like Christianity. Now, Rebecca McLaughlin, the author of Confronting Christianity, the book that we've been using for this class, she says, indeed, according to Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth Movement, the destruction of Christianity was explicitly recognized as a purpose of the National Socialist movement. What followed was a systematic attempt to recreate Jesus in the image of Hitler and the Nazis with the hopes of eventually destroying any vestige of Christianity in Germany. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels believed that there was an insoluble opposition between the Christian and a heroic German world view. References to Jesus' Jewishness were removed, and Jesus was recast as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan, the so-called master race, according to Nazi ideology. We don't need to go in much more detail about all this because it's clear what happened. Nazi Germany rejected basically everything Jesus taught. The Nazis urged devotion to the mighty Führer Hitler, not to the crucified Son of God, Jesus. Unfortunately, many Germans who identified as Christians believed these lies and bought into the Nazi program. Now, as much as Hitler and the Nazis twisted Christianity beyond recognition for their own purposes, they also promoted their worldview as a scientific one and used the supposedly clear evidence of science to justify their actions against racial and ethnic minorities. Hitler said this to justify his racism: "If nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with the stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one. Because in such a case, all her efforts throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile." He goes on to explain his evolutionary ethic. "The stronger must dominate and not mate with the weaker, which would signify the sacrifice of its own higher nature. Only the born weakling can look upon this principle as cruel, and if he does so, it is merely because he is of feebler nature or narrower mind. For if such a law did not direct the process of evolution, then the higher the development of organic life would not be conceivable at all." Guys, the implications of Hitler's ideology are clear. According to him, the development of the master race is reflected in nature. And in order to keep the race pure, it must dominate other inferior races of people. Now, Hitler wasn't the first one to come up with this idea, but the Nazis were the first to try to implement these ideas on a national and international scale. And the result was the Holocaust, during which time 6 million Jews were killed, not to mention Poles and Gypsies, religious and political opponents of the Nazis, homosexuals, as well as the mentally and physically handicapped. So, does religion cause violence? It certainly seems that some religions justify violence much more readily than others. But if we take 20th century history seriously, it's also clear that it doesn't take a traditional religion to incite violence and exterminate millions. In the midst of the violence throughout human history, there is a horrific and shameful act of violence at the heart of Christian faith: the crucifixion of Jesus. Christians understand that the crucifixion in a number of different ways. First, Jesus is the Passover lamb. He's our Passover lamb. John the Baptist recognized this when he saw Jesus for the first time. The next day, he saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is he of whom I said, after me comes a man who ranks before me, because he was before me. I myself did not know him, but for this purpose I came, baptizing with water, that he might be revealed to Israel." Jesus was crucified during the week of the Passover and is consistently presented as offering to take upon himself the punishment for sin. Second, when Jesus allowed himself to be taken and crucified, what he did in that moment was to allow death to do its absolute worst. And Jesus knew the worst death could do would not be enough in the end, that God's power was greater and that God would raise him. Instead of using violence as a way to gain earthly power and control over others, Jesus allowed violence to do its worst so he could show how the kind of earthly power that uses violence to enslave and oppress others was ultimately powerless. The author of Hebrews urges his audience to run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus saw the violence of the cross as a symbol of the devil's power over the world, but by letting the devil do his worst, Jesus brought victory over sin's curse. Christians believe that Jesus' victory over the cross turns the world's ways upside down. Jesus' death and resurrection actually subvert the cross's original meaning, a cruel symbol of Satan's power over the world, and now the cross has become a symbol of life, according to Mark chapter 8, verses 34 and 35. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wants to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." So, does religion cause violence? It can, just as easily as anti-religious sentiment can cause violence too. But crusades, jihads, concentration camps, gulags, and holocausts have no place in the life and ministry of Jesus. And despite Christian failures to live up to Jesus' standards, Jesus' ethic is one that honors the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, and He calls His followers to that very standard. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I've really been enjoying this series, and I hope you have too. If you know somebody who has raised these objections or is struggling with these questions, let me encourage you to share these videos with them. Some of these questions are pretty tough, but I think we can give good answers to the issues that people have been raising. What I've tried to do each week is to point people to Jesus, to show how He taught us to live. And really that's what every Christian's life ought to do, is to show other people to Jesus, to point other people to Jesus. Guys, thank you all again. Hope you have a good week. Stay safe, and hopefully we'll be able to see each other again in person sooner rather than later. Bye-bye.